I stepped into my Beverly Hills penthouse to the sound of clinking champagne glasses. My father, Gregory, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows with my mother, Patricia, and my brother-in-law, Tyler. They were celebrating. Gregory looked at me with a cold, triumphant smirk, announcing he had just sold my apartment to save his failing investment firm. I did not cry. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I smiled, walked to the Marble Island, and unlatched my briefcase. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I looked at the three of them, observing their smug expressions as they waited for a breakdown. They expected screaming, pleading, or the familiar tears of a daughter desperate for her family's approval. But there was no panic in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret. But there was only absolute clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I calmly told my father that I was not angry. In fact, I was incredibly relieved. I reached into my briefcase, the leather cool and firm under my fingertips, and pulled out a single, neatly bound legal document. I slid it across the flawless marble counter. I watched his arrogant eyes scan the cover page. I watched the color slowly drain from his face as he realized exactly what he was looking at. The penthouse was not in my name, nor was it in his. The penthouse has been protected under an irrevocable family trust established by our grandfather. It was explicitly structured to prevent predatory liquidation, and as the trustee, I am the only one with the legal standing to authorize any asset movement. He had just attempted to sell a multi-million-dollar asset he had absolutely zero legal right to liquidate. For my entire life, I had been the silent investor in their twisted version of a family, while my younger sister, Madison, was constantly pampered and handed everything she ever desired on a silver platter. I footed the bill for my own existence. I paid for my own architecture degree, working grueling double shifts, while they happily funded her luxury vacations and designer wardrobes. I worked 80-hour weeks to build my firm from nothing, while they paraded her around as the golden child of the household. I was the reliable, invisible machine they only bothered to plug in when they needed an upgrade or a financial safety net. For a long time, I did not understand my own silence, but looking at them now, I finally understood the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a brutal, psychological imprisonment where the responsible child learns helplessness disguised as duty. You endure the abuse because your brain tricks you into believing that endurance is your only currency for love. It is a prison without bars, built entirely on the false premise that if you just give enough, suffer enough, or achieve enough, they will finally value your existence. Now, I realized that their familial affection had always been a transactional subscription, and I had simply stopped paying the premium. The silence in the room was deafening. They were not shocked by what they had done to me. They were completely shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. Tyler scoffed, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence in the kitchen. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, stepping forward with the unearned confidence of a mediocre finance bro who thought he controlled the room. He chuckled condescendingly and told me to leave the real business to the men. He called me a drawing artist, claiming I was completely out of my depth and did not understand how real corporate structures worked. He leaned against the counter, practically bragging as he explained his brilliant strategy to me. He detailed, step by step, how he had routed the penthouse sale funds through a complex web of offshore shell companies. He proudly explained that this was done to bypass any trust restrictions, laundering the money to artificially inflate Gregory's failing investment firm. He was so incredibly proud of his financial gymnastics, completely unaware of the legal rope he was actively tying around his own neck. He spoke to me as if I were a child who needed a lesson in basic economics, outlining his fraudulent transfers with absolute glee. Patricia stepped up beside him, her face twisting into that familiar, demanding scowl she reserved exclusively for me. She told me I needed to step up and support the family business. She ordered me to stop being difficult, to pick up a pen, and to immediately sign the retroactive authorization forms that would supposedly make Tyler's fraudulent sale legal. She spoke with the entitlement of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. Gregory chimed in, his voice dropping to a low, threatening growl that used to terrify me when I was younger. He told me that if I did not sign those papers right that second, I would be disowned. He said I would be cut out of the family legacy forever, erased from their lives, and left with absolutely nothing. He thought the threat of losing them would break my resolve. He still thought I viewed our relationship through the lens of a desperate daughter seeking validation. He did not realize I was looking at them through the cold lens of a forensic accountant viewing a massive liability. I listened to Tyler outline his elaborate money laundering scheme, taking precise mental notes of every admission he freely offered up. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they mistook my calculated silence for submission. I did not interrupt him. You never interrupt an enemy when they are making a critical mistake, especially when they are confessing to federal crimes. I let him finish his arrogant speech. I let my parents deliver their hollow ultimatums. Then I reached back into my briefcase. I remained completely impassive. I pulled out a second, much thicker folder. This one was bound in bright red. I dropped it on the island counter. The sound it made was heavy and incredibly final. I told Tyler that his offshore strategy was genuinely fascinating, specifically his clever use of Vanguard holdings to mask the transaction. He smirked broadly, clearly assuming I was finally acknowledging his superior intellect and business acumen. Then I opened the red folder to the first tab. I slid a certified corporate registration document directly toward him. I explained that Vanguard Holdings was indeed a highly secure, completely anonymous shell company. I had set it up as an anonymous vehicle years ago, specifically leaving its administrative access credentials exposed in our shared cloud server. I knew you couldn't resist using it for your offshore schemes, which is exactly why I kept it dormant, waiting for you to deposit the funds. I identified it immediately during my forensic audit of your offshore transactions. It is a shell entity you used for the money laundering, which I have already flagged and placed under a federal lien through my firm's legal counsel. I was the sole proprietor and sole beneficiary of that holding company. Tyler's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. He stared at the piece of paper, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting back and forth as his brain struggled to process the devastating data. I walked him through the legal architecture of what he had just done. I explained that by forging the sale of my penthouse and routing those funds into a holding company that belonged exclusively to me, he had essentially stolen money from the buyer and deposited it directly into my private accounts. I broke down the corporate structure for him, speaking in the same cold, methodical tone I used when explaining load-bearing walls to difficult contractors. He had not outsmarted the trust. He had unknowingly executed a flawless transfer of wealth into my absolute control, but the accounting did not stop there. I pointed to the bank routing numbers highlighted in bright yellow ink on the next page. I explained that because the funds had crossed international borders through his unauthorized wire transfers, he had committed federal wire fraud. He had initiated the transactions himself. His digital signature was logged on every single routing document. My parents had co-signed the initial transfer orders. They had not just botched a real estate transaction. They had built an ironclad federal case against themselves and willingly handed me the keys to their destruction. The room went dead silent as the gravity of their legal exposure settled over them. They were trapped in a cage of their own design, and I held the only key. Gregory slammed his hand on the marble, demanding to know what kind of sick game I was playing. But this was not a game. It was a controlled demolition. I turned to the next section of the red folder. I told them I had been quietly auditing their finances for the past 5 years. I slid a copy of a commercial loan agreement across the counter. It was dated exactly 5 years ago, the precise time they had miraculously found the seed money to purchase their massive Beverly Hills mansion. I pointed to the guarantor's signature line at the very bottom. It was an obvious forgery, and I have already attached the affidavit from a certified document examiner confirming that the signature is not mine and the notary stamp is invalid. Patricia gasped loudly, stepping back as if the paper itself had burned her skin. I laid out the timeline with clinical precision. They had used my burgeoning architectural firm as collateral to secure a multi-million-dollar loan without my knowledge or consent. They had committed identity theft, bank fraud, and grand larceny to fund their lavish, fake upper-class lifestyle. I looked Gregory dead in the eye and told him that they were not just facing a civil eviction from my penthouse. They were facing federal prison. The shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. The villain's arrogance shattered into pure, unadulterated panic. Tyler backed away from the counter, his hands trembling violently. Patricia covered her mouth. her eyes wide with undeniable terror. Gregory's chest heaved, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as his false empire collapsed. Their entire identity was built on the illusion of power from an empty wallet. They had confused the wealth they possessed with their actual value. Their social standing, their arrogance, their cruelty, it was all a rented facade. The moment the money evaporated, they had no intrinsic worth to fall back on to keep them standing. They crumbled instantly because they were fundamentally hollow people. They had spent their entire lives pretending to be untouchable titans of industry, but stripped of their stolen capital, they were nothing more than common thieves waiting for the authorities to arrive. The power dynamic had not just flipped, it had been entirely erased from existence. Gregory lunged across the kitchen island, his face twisted in desperate, unhinged rage. He raised his hand, attempting to physically intimidate me into backing down, trying to use the same fear tactics that had worked when I was a child. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I looked him dead in the eye and calmly informed him that the federal authorities had received the entire digital dossier 20 minutes before I walked through the door. He froze mid-motion. His arm dropped limply to his side. The realization that there was no negotiation, no threatening his way out of this, finally hit him with the force of a freight train. The game was entirely over. Patricia broke down completely. She fell to her knees on the hardwood floor, clutching the edge of the marble counter. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging for mercy, pleading with me to remember that she was my mother, crying that family always forgives family. She frantically offered to give the money back, promising they would leave town and never Zansev bother me again if I just made the phone call stop. Tyler did not beg. He immediately turned on them like a coward. He pointed a trembling finger at Gregory and shouted that he was just following orders. Tyler frantically claimed that my father had forced him to set up the shell companies, that he was an innocent victim of their manipulation and greed. He was desperately trying to throw my parents under the bus to save his own skin. It was pathetic, clinical proof that their familial loyalty was as counterfeit as their wealth. I watched them turn on each other like cornered animals fighting for scraps. This was not revenge. It was accounting. I reached into my briefcase one final time. I pulled out 3 printed documents and handed them out to the weeping, shaking messes in front of me. They were formal eviction notices for their Beverly Hills mansion, which I now legally owned after absorbing the defaulted fraudulent loan, along with the corporate bankruptcy filings for Gregory's firm. I informed them that given the immediate freezing of the trust assets and the pending foreclosure filings, their right to reside there had effectively terminated. They would be served with an official eviction notice by the sheriff's department by the end of the week, and their access to all luxury services would be cut off immediately. I turned my back on them, packed up my briefcase, and listened to the satisfying sound of their complete and utter ruin. 2 days later, the federal agents arrived at the Beverly Hills mansion to serve the warrants. I watched the local news reports from the quiet sanctuary of my penthouse. Gregory and Tyler were escorted out in handcuffs, their faces shielded from the flashing cameras. Patricia trailed behind them, a broken shadow of the woman who used to command rooms with her cruelty. Their bank accounts were frozen, their assets seized, their carefully curated reputation destroyed overnight. The silence in my apartment was profound, and for the first time in my entire life, it truly felt like peace. I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, feeling the cool evening wind against my face as I looked out over the sprawling lights of the city. I took a deep breath, and the air tasted like absolute freedom. I have come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiving them did not mean allowing them to stay in my life. It meant releasing the debt they owed my soul while holding them accountable for the debt they owed the law. To anyone out there who has always felt like an outsider in their own home, this letter is for you. You are not broken because you do not fit into a toxic mold. Your worth is not defined by people who demand you shrink yourself to make them comfortable. Walking away from the people who share your blood is the hardest thing you will ever do. But the family you choose will love you for who you are, not for what you can provide. Your independence is your power, and your success will be the ultimate boundary. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to save your own life? Share your story in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe for more lessons on setting boundaries.